31. The reason I'm asking, Jane said, is because I've had some eerie premonitions about that doll. I had a bad feeling about it the first time I laid eyes on it. I also had a bad dream that night in Thailand. My dream was a bit like the nightmare you had here during our first night together. While he looked at her expressionlessly, she told him all about the dream Lawan, the adolescent girl who had murdered her siblings before their avenging father dispatched her as well. She told him how Kaji's doll had made an appearance in that dream, as well as her ultimate, admittedly crazy, suspicion that the doll had somehow been fused with the spirit of the long-ago girl named Lawan. David's reaction simultaneously shocked, dismayed, and wounded her. "Jane," he said, "that sounds to me, if you don't mind my saying so, like a bunch of superstitious nonsense. Look at the two of us. I'm an engineer with a master's degree in mechanical engineering. You have an MBA. We both have responsible jobs. We're both well into adulthood, early middle age, you might say, and we're standing here talking about haunted dolls. One of us is, anyway." His last little barb had been unnecessary and condescending. Did David think that having spent a number of nights in her bed, he was now free to talk down to her, to cast her as a simpleton in order to make himself feel superior? Clearly, David had been more unnerved by the doll, by his dream, than he was letting on. Like her, though, his entire life was based on a certain model of rationality. Also, like her, he was fearful of the cascading effect that a single significant crack in the foundation might bring. The difference was that whereas she was, belatedly perhaps, willing to talk about the matter, he was clamming up, focused more than anything on protecting his ego, his self-image as the consummately rational male, and if he had to belittle her in order to accomplish this, so be it. "Really?" she asked. "Well, I seem to remember an early middle-aged engineer with a master's degree crying out in my bed in the middle of the night, terrified of what he had seen in his sleep." He recoiled, and she could see that now she was the one who had wounded him. Well, it served him right, given the way he had wounded her. They were now, she sensed, on the verge of a serious argument, possibly of the relationship-ending kind. "Jane," he said quietly, "I had a bad dream. You had a bad dream. That doesn't mean that we had the same dream, or that our dreams were in any way connected." "We both dreamed about a young Asian girl," Jane cut in. "What if we had both dreamed about an alligator, or a bear, or the boogeyman? Would you still see a connection? Think about it for a moment, Jane. In the last 15 years or so, there have been all those Japanese horror films. We've both seen them. Some of them have female ghosts. It seems to me like you're stretching the facts to suit the explanation you prefer." "So what are you saying then? Are you saying that it's less of a stretch to suggest that a ghost, an evil spirit, caused us to have the same dream? Is that less of a stretch than saying that the same cultural elements might have been recycled by our individual subconscious minds in a similar way? Let's be logical here." "Oh, so now you're Spock, is that it?" It was a childish rejoinder, she knew. She had to laugh then, and he laughed with her. But she still wasn't pleased with his imperious attitude. Her observation that something had scared him, perhaps seriously, didn't make him any less of a condescending jerk at the moment. "What this is really about, Jane, is you keeping an item that obviously upsets you. That upsets this rationally minded engineer too. David didn't say this, but he might as well have. Listen," he said. "I don't want us to fight about this. Thank you for having me here last night, and thank you for the wonderful coffee." He grinned, and she gave him a small, "I'll meet you halfway" smile. "I'm scheduled to give a presentation at our Monday morning departmental meeting tomorrow, and I have to go into the office this afternoon to prepare. Why don't we talk about this later, if we need to? And for what it's worth, I may have overreacted just a bit." "Yes, you did." "Well, consider this an apology." He leaned forward and embraced her, then kissed her briefly. She noticed that he looked at Lawan as he did so. She could not help thinking, does he expect the doll to intervene? Does he expect the doll to be jealous of what we have? 32. Jane spent the rest of her Sunday alone, which, on balance, was fine with her. Sunday was her day for decompressing. The day was a short interval of rest between whatever she had going on during the weekend and the chaotic start of the work week. It was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Jane decided to take a nap, a rare luxury, given her lifestyle and packed schedule. She reclined on the sofa in her living room, her mind a jumble. David, work, Thailand, and the doll. The damn doll. Why had she and David allowed themselves to fight over a stupid doll? That was almost as inexplicable as the dreams and the weird coincidences. Just before she drifted off, she heard a faint voice from the spare room. She was in that twilight state between waking and sleeping. When she woke from her nap about an hour later and fuzzily recalled the utterance, she would doubt that she had heard anything at all. It had to be her imagination playing tricks on her. She had been thinking too much of late about the doll, about the nightmares that she and David had experienced. The single word, faint and in a young girl's voice, had been, "Mommy." The next day, Monday, Jane found herself distracted at the office. David had neither texted nor called her since leaving her condo the previous morning. That wasn't like him. They weren't a clingy couple who called each other a half-dozen times per day. They were both way too busy for that kind of excess. But a day rarely passed without 2 or 3 text exchanges. Then she remembered his presentation, his departmental meeting. Perhaps there was a problem with one of David's assignments, a problem that fully consumed his time and attention. She couldn't be sure. By mutual agreement, they rarely talked about their jobs, except in broad outlines. They both agreed that they spent more than enough time at work and thinking about work. They didn't need to bring all that stress and conflict home and into their relationship. That night, at home, she started to push the speed dial button for his number and stopped herself. No, she wasn't going to become the girlfriend who was desperate for attention and reaffirmation. Experience had taught her that was a good way to become someone's ex-girlfriend. There was no harm in sending a text message, though. "I hope you're okay." An hour later, a text came back. "Okay, how are you?" She was more stung by his perfunctory reply than she would have been by a failure to respond at all. He had offered no explanation for his long silence. He had not even acknowledged his silence, in fact. Was this David's way of trying to ease out of the relationship? They had preserved their bond, even without sex, throughout his extended trip to Germany. They had no real issues. There were no arguments about either side trying to push the other into an early commitment, no notable jealousies on either side. Everything between them had seemed to be perfect until the doll became involved. David had been distracted by it before he had known of its existence. Somehow. Then his mood totally changed the first time he saw it. Jane tallied up all of the losses she had endured since Lawan had come into her life. Dusty, and now, probably, David, a boyfriend and a cat. What was next? Was she going to be diagnosed with cancer? Her parents were in good health, but they were both well into their 60s. Stop it. This was exactly the type of superstitious thinking that had so annoyed David, that had somewhat inexplicably set him off. For what it was worth, she still didn't accept the notion that the doll atop the bookcase in her spare bedroom was haunted by the ghost of the adolescent girl she had seen in her nightmare. The dream girl was probably, as David had suggested, a cultural meme that had somehow been worked into her subconscious mind and recycled there. Jane didn't believe in angel dolls or spirit dolls. The basic premise of the LUK THEP, to use a non-technical term, was a load of hooey. Jane was, however, open to the idea of bad vibes, as vaporous and new agey as that sounded. The doll wasn't haunted. It probably wasn't haunted. But it might contain negative energy. There were places and objects like that in the world, right? And consider the suggestibility of people and circumstances when exposed to practices like seances and voodoo. Negative energy could be physical or psychological, or perhaps some combination of the two. Negative energy was a concept that could be accommodated to the belief system of a finance major or an engineer. And it was safe to say at this belated juncture that the doll Kaji had named Lawan possessed some kind of negative energy, or else the energy possessed the doll. Either way, it amounted to the same thing. That night, Jane slept easily, having at last arrived at a decision. This would be her last night sleeping under the same roof with the doll. Forget about eBay. She was going to take action first thing in the morning before she left for work. 33. A little after 6:30 a.m., Jane walked into the spare bedroom with an empty 20-gallon black garbage bag. She was reminded of a ritual she had often endured with Dusty before the cat had disappeared. When it was time for a visit to the vet, she would place Dusty in a cat carrier. The carrier was an oblong plastic container with a handle. A longtime cat owner, Jane knew better than to let a cat roam free in her car while she was driving. A cat, unlike most dogs, would not sit still in the passenger seat. Like all cats, Dusty had hated any variety of spatial restraint. After several trips in the cat carrier, it seemed to Jane that Dusty had learned to recognize the carrier when she brought it out of storage. The cat appeared to actively avoid her when she removed the carrier from the closet, so Jane had learned to be furtive. She wondered now, crazily, if the doll atop the bookcase, or whatever bad vibes might inhabit it, had any grasp of the purpose of the black bag. "Too late, Lawan," Jane said, lifting the doll from the spot it had occupied for several months now. "I've come to serve your eviction notice. You're no longer welcome here." Having placed the doll in the bag, Jane exited her condo. She double-checked the lock. She had made a habit of double-checking the door since Dusty's disappearance. She carried her attaché case in one hand and the garbage bag in the other. It was that time of morning when many of the building's residents were leaving for work, and she passed several of her neighbors on the way downstairs, then out back to the dumpster. None of them made any remarks about the black garbage bag in her hand. At a superficial glance, there was nothing strange about what she was doing. All of the residents disposed of their garbage in the dumpster. Standing before the dumpster, Jane set her attaché case on the ground. She grabbed the neck of the bag and gave it a little swing for momentum. Then she heaved the bag over the side of the dumpster. It was done. Jane heard, but did not see, the bag containing Lawan plop down amid other garbage bags and loose debris. Today was garbage pickup day, as chance would have it. The Rumpke truck would be here within a few hours. By the time Jane arrived home from work tonight, Lawan would already be in an incinerator or a landfill. A robin landed on the pavement not far away. In the suburbs near the city, the robins were bold. They knew that humans posed no threat. Was this the first robin she had seen this season? She believed so. Jane was willing to take the bird as an omen. A good omen. According to the online weather forecast, today the mercury would climb into the upper 70s. It really did feel like spring out here. Early summer even. Jane thought of David. He had been a bit of a jerk, and she was annoyed at his apparently deliberate silence since Sunday. However, he might have been legitimately spooked. She would call him this evening and tell him that the doll was gone. He might interpret that as a victory, a concession on her part. Oh well. Jane had observed long ago that it was always a bad idea to view a relationship as a tennis match, where you kept track of every point won and lost. The bottom line was that the doll had somehow been toxic, but the line below that was that the doll was now gone and gone forever. The dumpster was in an enclosed area behind the building. She would have to re-enter the building and proceed to the far end of one of the first-floor hallways to reach the resident parking lot. As Jane turned away from the dumpster, she felt buoyant, filled with certainty that an important obstacle, if only a psychological one, had been overcome. She and David would make amends. The two of them would have a good summer together, 34, but events did not play out as they were supposed to. Over the next 2 days, David did not call or text her. He did not respond to Jane's text messages and voicemails. Jane now began to grow actively worried. Even the most cattish man would, by this time, send a peremptory message along the lines of, "Sorry, but this just isn't working out," or "I think we need some time apart." Her concern over David was starting to bleed into her performance at work. She wasn't the only one who noticed. Martin walked into her office and closed the door after lunch. "Jane," he said with a genuinely concerned expression on his face, "is anything wrong?" Jane, of course, told Martin that no, absolutely nothing was wrong. She had been a little stressed of late over some projects, she said. That was all. She gave Martin her best can-do smile and wondered how her boss had noticed. Martin had not mentioned any glaring mistakes. That much was a relief. If she kept going like this, however, it would be only a matter of time before she did make a major blunder. If my personal life is going to forever be in a shambles, Jane thought, then I had better, at least, make the most of my career. But thoughts of David, of what might have happened to him, persisted. She had only a few, fleeting thoughts about the LUK THEP doll. Good riddance. She drove home from work after a late meeting, into a glorious sunset. The Detroit area was not known for its scenery, but almost any place was made beautiful by the picturesque orange glow of a fading horizon. The first summer-like sunset of the year, Jane thought. David and I should be enjoying this together. Tomorrow would be Friday, the start of the weekend, and she hadn't heard from David since that awkward Sunday afternoon when they had quarreled over the doll. The sole consolation here was that Lawan was by now, in all likelihood, beneath several tons of garbage in a landfill. Later that evening, Jane lay in bed unable to sleep. It was ironic. When the creepy doll was in the spare room, she had generally slept without difficulty. Now that the doll was gone, she was troubled by insomnia. She had had difficulty sleeping all week. Her falling out with David was certainly part of the problem, but Jane was no schoolgirl. She had endured breakups with boyfriends before. She contemplated the pill bottle in the top right drawer of her bathroom vanity, the one that she had promised never to open again, even though she had balked at throwing it away. The pills had helped her sleep before, but at a price. 2 years ago, shortly after she had started traveling to the Far East for TRX Automotive, Jane had been plagued by insomnia when she changed time zones. It wasn't too bad when you made the trip from North America to Asia. Typically a sleepy afternoon or two, and a slightly modified bedtime were all she suffered during a week in Japan or South Korea. The killer was the week after you returned. Following each Asian business trip, Jane had found herself nodding off in meetings and walking around the halls of TRX Automotive's Michigan headquarters like a half-comatose zombie. Every day after lunch, she was seized by an unconquerable urge to take a nice long nap. But when it was time to sleep at night, she would be wide awake. Her friends began to tease her about all the social media updates she made between 1 and 3 a.m. Jane had finally gone to her doctor and obtained a prescription for sleeping pills. The pills were known chemically as Zolpidem. They were sold under various trade names, including Ambien. The pills helped her sleep at night, but they also made her woozy and slow-moving throughout the day. They slowed down her thinking process. It was like being drugged and hungover, 24 hours per day. After a few days of coping with the constant drug-induced stupor, Jane had stowed the pills away in her bathroom and simply toughed out the jet lag. By the time she had made a half-dozen trips to and from Asia, she learned to cope with jet lag by sleeping aboard her return flight. Melatonin also helped restore her circadian rhythms during the first week back. Since then, she had seldom been tempted to resort to the pills, even though she hadn't thrown them away. But tonight, she was feeling the pull of that pill bottle. She had promised herself that she would only take another Zolpidem in the case of an emergency. Well, she hadn't slept all week. Didn't that constitute an emergency? 35. The Zolpidem helped her sleep, but as before, it extracted a price. When Jane's alarm clock went off Friday morning, it was difficult to rouse herself from sleep, as if sleep itself were a solid substance that clung to her, pulled her down. Somehow she managed to get dressed and drive to work. On the way in, she stopped at Starbucks and ordered a large coffee via the drive-through window. The coffee made her nervous and fidgety rather than alert. David had still not called. He had not responded to her text messages. Luckily, Martin was in meetings throughout most of the day. She knew that she was not in her best form. If her boss had been harboring any doubts about her performance, those doubts would become more acute if the two of them interacted much today. Shortly after 10 a.m., she stopped typing a work-related email midway through and pulled her cell phone from her purse. Still nothing from David. She had already sent him numerous messages. What was one more? Where are you? I'm starting to get worried. Technology made it so easy for men to discard women, for women to discard men. If that was truly what David was doing, Jane now had to seriously weigh the possibility that David might be ill. The more she thought about it, his behavior the previous Sunday had been highly erratic, out of character. It was more than simply his reaction to the doll, which had been way out of proportion. She'd gone so far, sending all these unanswered text messages and voicemails. Why not take the next, logical, step? She planned to visit David's house after work. They had spent most of their nights together at Jane's condo, but she had been to his house a half-dozen times. He lived in Royal Oak, another upscale Detroit suburb. Royal Oak lay one exit directly east of Novi on I-696. Jane returned her cell phone to her purse, then cried out, startled, when it began to ring. "David?" she asked, clicking the call answer button. She didn't recognize the number, though it was a local one. David might have lost his old cell phone and purchased a new one. That was the half-formed explanation that she was grasping at as she waited for the person on the other end of the call to respond. 36. A female voice answered. Her immediate thought was that David had lied to her all along, that the woman was David's wife. A number of years ago, she had gone on several dates with a man, only to discover, through some independent research on the internet, that he was actually married. Perhaps David was in fact married too. Perhaps his wife traveled a lot. It was possible. Then, through the haze of the sleeping pills, she managed to process what the woman was saying, but she had to ask the woman to repeat her words. "I said I'm his sister. My name is Tammy." Yes, David had mentioned a sister, a few years younger than him, and her name was Tammy. Given the relative newness of their relationship, Jane had never met Tammy, though she had seen a few photos of her. A pleasantly attractive blonde woman, just short of being really pretty. Like David, she had a lanky, athletic build. But why did Tammy sound so distraught? Why was Tammy calling her in the first place? Speaking through barely restrained sobs, Tammy answered Jane's unspoken questions. "There was an accident," Tammy explained. "My brother was killed 2 nights ago, they think." Tammy elaborated as Jane listened, speechless, in a virtual stupor. They didn't know with complete certainty when David was killed, because it had been a single-car accident. But probably it had been the night before last, while he was coming home from work. His car had gone off into a ravine and hadn't been discovered until last night. The police told David's family that he had most likely been distracted while he was driving. It might have been a wasp or a bumblebee. That sort of thing happens sometimes. But it was a bit early in the Michigan summer for stinging insects, and David wasn't that easily rattled, Tammy speculated, crying now. Tammy reported that David's phone had been found in the front passenger footwell. Without a doubt, some of Jane's texts and voicemails had arrived before David's accident. Many of them, however, she had sent to a dead man. David's phone had chimed and ringed with her attempts at contact, while David's corpse lay nearby, lodged in his crumpled vehicle. Why had David not contacted her before his untimely death? Had David really been that angry over their silly quarrel? Or had he been afraid? "I know you two had become very close in a short period of time," Tammy was saying now. "He talked about you a lot, so I wanted to make sure you were informed right after the immediate family members. I did see some of your messages, and it's obvious that the two of you had a falling out this past week. That aside, though, I can tell you that David did have real feelings for you." Jane tried to respond, but the words were choked in her throat. Later she would cry, she knew. She would break down and sob uncontrollably. But for the moment she was in shock, and the zolpidem had clogged up all her mental circuitry. This might be a bad dream. It truly felt like a dream. "Do you want to come to the funeral?" Tammy asked. Jane forced herself to speak now, though her words were dry and half choked off. Yes, of course she would attend the funeral. 37. 1 week after Tammy's phone call, the day after David's funeral. Mercifully, David's family had decided to cremate his remains. There was no body to look at in an open casket, no dead face of her ex-lover to rebuke her. Rebuke her for what? David had sensed that there was something wrong with the LUK THEP doll, but his personal belief system, his adherence to scientific rationality, had prevented him from revealing what he truly suspected, or, perhaps more likely, David had had no concrete suspicions. Rather, he had been troubled by his wordless instincts, which were beyond the empirical disciplines upon which he had based both his professional and private lives. Jane had taken a personal vacation day yesterday. David had been neither her relative nor her husband, so the company's bereavement leave policy had not been applicable. When she returned today, Martin gave her an avuncular pat on the shoulder and told her to hang in there. He was so sorry, he said, for all that had happened. Jane had taken another Zolpidem last night. She knew she had to quit now, knew that she was spiraling into what? Addiction? Well, dependency at the very least. Early this morning, she had experienced 2 dreams. In the first one, David was driving home along a twisting road a few miles beyond the interstate. He turned his head to the right, and Lawan was seated on the passenger seat. Only now the doll wasn't only Lawan, the piece of plastic, but a fusion of the adolescent girl from her original dream and a modified, hideously alive version of the doll. Crazy, ridiculous. But the second dream, though less fantastic in nature, had been even more disturbing. She and David had never had their falling out. His accident had never happened. David was still alive and, better yet, the 2 of them were married. Somehow they had a teenage daughter, an Asian girl named Lawan, and other children as well, little ones. One weekend morning, she and David were luxuriating in bed, sleeping late, in a master bedroom that was obviously attached to an expensive suburban house. The American dream. Lawan burst in on them, just as they were starting to cuddle, and perhaps get a bit friendly before the rest of the house woke up. Then the teenage Lawan told them to come downstairs. With a weak smile, she informed her American parents that she'd done something naughty with her younger siblings. 38. Jane was beginning to feel better after lunch. Martin had generously offered to cover her 11 a.m. meeting. She had availed herself of a light morning, work-wise, and then a lunch at an open-air bistro not far from the office. It was a sunny day and fully summer-like. She was starting to feel better, and she was touched by Martin's gesture. Jane realized that this surfeit of personal consideration on Martin's part would not last forever. Practically every other person at the company, it seemed, was coping with some personal challenge or recent loss. Among her co-workers, there were people of various ages who had lost siblings, spouses, and even children. There were divorces and loved ones who struggled with addiction. Nevertheless, everyone had to buck up and perform his or her job. She was no different. And speaking of addiction, she would have to rid herself of the pills. She had 10 Zolpidem pills left. She would not have the prescription renewed. She would take no more after she had taken those 10. She knew that was a lie. She should stop taking them immediately. If she were a stronger person, she would flush the remaining 10 pills down the toilet tonight. Jane was actually relieved when she heard the monotone chime of the company's internal instant messaging application. She looked up at her desktop PC and saw the familiar message window. In principle, the company messaging app functioned like those available for the consumer market. The messaging app was installed on all company PCs and handheld devices. Some TRX employees liked the app more than others. Martin used it frequently. Jane therefore assumed that the incoming message was from Martin. That would have been her best guess. But the message in the window was cryptic in its simplicity, and not a message that Martin would be likely to send. Hello. In the top frame of the window there was a bar that identified the source of the message by username. Martin's username was M. Tully. There was no M. Tully in the sender field. In fact, this field was completely blank. No sender was identified at all. Yet the message had clearly been intended for Jane. Her username, J. Hughes, was right there in the recipient field. Strange, yes, but not unheard of. The most likely explanation was that the message had been intended for another recipient, reaching Jane by mistake. That might be attributed to a typo. The message suggested both intimacy and an inside joke, so whoever sent it would likely be embarrassed by their little flub. Jane typed, "Who is this, please? This is Jane Hughes." She pushed the send button. She had anticipated a nervous, apologetic reply after a minute or two of contemplation on the other end. Complete silence was another possibility. The lack of a sender identification might have been deliberate. TRX had its share of men who eyed their female colleagues a little too conspicuously while passing in the hallways and queuing at the coffee machines. Perhaps some anonymous would-be Lothario was trolling for female attention. This might be an HR issue. But the return message came back immediately, as if it had already been typed into the message field, awaiting only the send button on the other end. It read, "I know you. You're my mommy." 39. Jane gasped aloud. She was seated, fortunately, for the walls of her office started to spin ever so slightly. With great effort, she forced her perception of those walls to remain still. Had someone at TRX known about Kaji's gift of the doll and her reaction to it? Only Martin and Kaji would have the slightest inkling, and neither of them could know the whole story. Her dreams and waking hallucinations, David's dreams, and her Sunday afternoon quarrel with David over the doll. David was the only other person who had grasped the situation to any significant extent, and David was— No, she wouldn't allow herself to contemplate that. The sender was probably an unmarried middle-aged man who was too close to his mother and was attempting to eroticize. Jane felt a sudden chill up her spine and was struck by a sudden intuition that she was not alone in the room. The last time she had felt that sensation, she was in Thailand, in Kaji's office. That had been an entirely different setting, though. Kaji's office was in a foreign country, and it had been late at night. Jane's office was sunlit by a wall of windows that allowed the early afternoon sun to stream in. Of course, she had been jet-lagged then, and she was hungover on Zolpidem now. She wouldn't have been able to define exactly what drew her gaze to the bookcase on the other side of the room. This was a much smaller bookcase than the one she kept in her spare room at home. Whereas the one at home was large and fashioned from real wood, this one was small, compact and corporate-like, comprised of metal and plastic. She used this bookcase to store company policy manuals and brochures from vendors and would-be vendors. In her position at TRX Automotive, Jane was bombarded with all of these materials. Lawan was perched atop the bookcase, near a stack of glossy brochures and vendor prospectuses that Jane had picked up at a recent automotive industry trade show. Jane gasped and recoiled, pushed her chair away from her desk and backward in the opposite direction. She involuntarily thought of David driving along that twisted road, of the unexplained single-car accident that had killed him. Jane had learned, inadvertently, as this wasn't knowledge that she had in any way sought or desired, that David was most likely killed suddenly when his neck was broken. But had he really been alone in that car? She expected the doll to leap across the room at her, to open its mouth and reveal rows of tiny incisors. But Lawan merely stared at Jane, smiling, still, eternally patient. "Jane?" When her name was spoken, Jane whirled around in her chair. David had walked into her office, or so she momentarily believed. 40. No, it was not David but Martin who had walked into her office. "Jane, are you okay?" Martin asked. There was real concern in his voice and in his facial expression. "You look like you've seen—" "A ghost," Jane thought but did not say. Martin's reasons for not finishing the phrase would have been obvious, but there was, still, the doll here in her office, the doll that should have been long gone, the doll that she recalled throwing into a dumpster. Martin followed her line of sight and noticed Lawan. "Oh, yes," he said, "the doll that Kaji Wongsuan gave you." Martin eagerly grasped the diversion, anything to avoid asking Jane how she was doing, probably. "I know you didn't like it at first, but you might find that it comforts you now, oddly enough. Sometimes it's nice to have a familiar object around." What Martin was saying made little sense. She was making him nervous, and so he was babbling. Somehow, though, she had to try to make Martin understand what had happened. I threw it away, or at least I thought I did." Martin paused and regarded her curiously. "No, I don't think so, Jane. I think that it's been right here in your office for quite some time, maybe since the day you received it." He shrugged and looked back at the doll, then turned to her again. "I can't be sure, you know, but I'm almost certain this isn't the first time I've seen it there." That was impossible. Or was it? Jane was certain that she had thrown the doll in the dumpster. She was certain, at the very least, that she had thrown something in the dumpster one morning a little more than a week ago, before David's accident. But could she really be certain, 100% certain, of what had been inside that garbage bag? The pills, she knew, dulled her memories, and she had taken a lot of them. Too many. I got a message, she said. She could show Martin the cryptic message she had received via the corporate messaging app. Surely Martin would see it as odd too. Together, they might be able to figure this out. Come here, please. Take a look. Martin stepped behind Jane's desk and looked at her computer screen. Looking over her shoulder, he said, "Jane, the messaging app window is blank." What? Jane looked again and saw that the correspondence of the last few minutes had indeed been deleted. Or maybe it had never been there. No, it had been there. The doll is here, right? The doll that I threw in the dumpster last week. Martin sighed. Jane, I know you've had a very difficult few weeks. I was going to ask you to look into a supplier issue for me, but I think you need to take it easy today. I'll see to it myself. No, I can... It's okay, Jane, Martin said peremptorily. I know you'll be able to pull yourself together to pull out of this. The subtext was, you had better pull yourself together and pull out of this if you want to keep your job as TRX Automotive's Asian supply chain manager. But anyway, Martin said, you'll have a chance to thank Kaji for the doll in person if you'd like. She'll be here for the company's annual business meeting. I happen to see TRX Thailand's attendees list. Kaji and her boss, Ram Thong Chai, I think his name is, will be representing our Thai subsidiary. They should be arriving in Detroit tonight or tomorrow morning.